Hi folks, welcome back to the Tabletop's Edge. Today we're going to do a short video addressing one of the sections of the BCS series rules that can be a little tricky and trip up players as they are just learning the system. And specifically, we're going to be addressing zones of control, stopping engagements, and engagement zones. And what are the differences between an engagement zone and a zone of control? How do zones of control work in this series? What is a stopping engagement? How is that different from an engagement zone? That kind of stuff. And we're going to use a couple of simple examples here to show you what the rules look like actually on the map and in the course of play. Now, if you've been watching my last Blitzkrieg campaign playthrough, you will have seen me run through a number of these, talking about zones of control and doing a number of stopping engagements. Engagement zones, not so much. I haven't really talked about them, and that should be a bit of a clue that engagement zones are, I don't say they're less important, they're a little less common, at least in last Blitzkrieg. Now, if you go to another BCS game like Brazen Chariots, where you've got much more open terrain in the desert, or even Baptism by Fire, where the terrain is more open, engagement zones are going to, I think, come up a little more frequently. They're still present here in last Blitzkrieg, but because of the close nature of the terrain and a lot of times the poor visibility, you don't really realize that the engagement zone is sort of in effect because most times, or a lot of times, the visibility is limited to an adjacent hex. But we'll get to all that here over the next hopefully 10-15 minutes, and ideally after you've seen this and had a chance to sort of walk you through the rules, this will be a little bit clearer in your mind the next time you sit down to play some BCS. Now, for those of you following along at home, we're going to be discussing specifically rule sections 4.3, 4.4, and 4.5, which are found on pages 22 and 23 of the version 2.0 series rulebook. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive right in and see if we can't figure this out. First thing we're going to talk about are zones of control, or ZOCs, or ZOCs. Now, in BCS, there are two types of zones of control. You have normal ZOCs and you have AV ZOCs. And as you might expect, AV ZOCs are only exerted by units that have an armor value. Large number here, either in red or maybe it's a clear number, as we see here on this support unit. ZOCs work similarly to the standard sort of ZOCs you find in many games in this hobby. They are exerted by the unit into the 6 hexes that are adjacent to the unit. However, it's important to remember that terrain has no effect on ZOCs. So even if the terrain in the adjacent hex is prohibited to the unit exerting the ZOC, it will still exert the ZOC into that hex. So, for instance, with the American Armor unit here, we have a slope hex here. There's a little bit of that brown artwork in hex 2030. He can still exert, or he still does exert, an AV ZOC into this hex, even though he would be prohibited from entering it. And that's because at the scale of BCS, and specifically last Blitzkrieg, each of these hexes is only 1 kilometer across, so 1,000 meters. And the weaponry, certainly of an AV armed unit, has the ability to reach out into this 1 kilometer area here and control enemy movement. Even machine guns and small arms, for that matter, can reach well out into these hexes adjacent to a unit. So therefore, terrain has no impact on whether or not a zone of control exists in that hex. It will. So just all 6 hexes surrounding the unit will have a ZOC, either a normal or AV, exerted into it. Now, ZOCs have a few effects. They will stop the movement of enemy units that enter them. And this is where we get into the differences between a normal ZOC and an AV ZOC. In BCS, we have 3 types of movement. We have tactical movement, which is signified by a red movement factor, truck type of movement, which is signified by black movement factors, and leg movement type, signified by a white movement factor. Now, when entering a normal ZOC, if we were to instead have this engineer unit here, it has no armor value, we will ignore the support for the moment. I'll just remove this, make this perfectly clear. So we have a non-AV unit which does not have any support. He exerts a zone of control into a normal zone of control into the 6 hexes adjacent to him. When a unit that has leg or truck movement type moves into one of those hexes, they must stop movement. So the Panzer Grenadiers in their trucks, if they were to move here, they would have to stop. Similarly, if they were on their combat side with their leg movement, they would still have to stop. However, tactical type units do not need to stop if they enter a normal ZOC. If you want to stop a tactical mover, you're going to have an AV ZOC. And the way I like to think of it is with this tactical movement, you can think of the unit having armored vehicles of some kind. Not necessarily tanks, it could be half-tracks, armored cars, something along those lines. These truck-type movements are soft-skin vehicles, whether that's trucks, jeeps, carts, bicycles, you name it. These are vehicles that are big enough to be targeted at a distance, but do not have the armor protection that a tactical type movement unit does have. So, normal ZOC will stop truck and foot, but it will not stop tactical type movers. The AV ZOC, which again extends into just the 6 hexes adjacent to the unit, will force the tactical movers to stop and will create the requirement for a stopping engagement, and we'll get to those momentarily. A couple of more points about ZOCs. First of all, a ZOC can only be negated by friendly units for purposes of safe paths. So if we were set up like so, and we have the German HQ here, normally the zone of control, either a normal or an AV zone of control, will stop not only movement, but it will stop the tracing of a safe path for units. That could be negated by the presence of a friendly unit in that ZOC hex, but it will not allow a unit to enter the ZOC and then continue moving. There's no way to negate the stopping effect of a zone of control. Now for headquarters, not only can a headquarters unit, they don't, when they stop upon entry, they cannot even enter a zone of control. That can be negated by the presence of a friendly unit. So if we were to have the Panzer Grenadier Battalion here on the road, it would be legal for the headquarters to move into this hex because of the presence of the friendly unit in the hex. But without the Panzer Grenadier Battalion or another friendly unit present, the headquarters would have to stop here outside of the zone of control. Zones of control also affect retreats. If a retreat ends in a zone of control, then the retreating unit will lose 1 step. Also, for truck and foot type of movement, if they are surrounded by enemy units and or a combination of zones of control, the safe path back to the headquarters is going to be cut. And if that's the case, if a unit has no safe path, then it ignores the retreat and instead converts that to a 1-step loss. And that's for either a situational or an automatic retreat. So remember, when you're on the attack and you want to push the defenders out of that hex, make sure you leave a gap for them, a safe path that they can trace back to their headquarters if you want them to retreat. Otherwise, if you have them surrounded, as the Americans do here, you're going to have to eliminate the unit in order to clear that hex. Now, that only applies to truck type of movement and leg movement. If you have a tactical mover in red, they are never affected. The retreats are never affected by ZOCs for tactical movers. One last thing on ZOCs, specifically AV ZOCs. Now we've said to exert an AV ZOC requires an AV armed unit. However, it is possible for a non-AV unit to exert an AV ZOC if it has support. So we see the 25th Armored Engineer Battalion of 6th Armored Division, and we see 6th Armored Division has currently a tank destroyer battalion in support, which means that every non-AV, non-dual unit in this formation is going to exert an AV ZOC into its adjacent 6 hexes. AV ZOCs are divided up into 2 types. You have real AV ZOCs, which are exerted by actual AV units on the map, and you have support AV ZOCs, which are exerted by host units that have support currently. And there's a little bit of, they work pretty much the same with one major exception. And we'll talk about that very shortly. Because as we transition from our discussion about ZOCs, we're going to talk about stopping engagements. When a unit moves into an AV ZOC, it may require a stopping engagement to be done. So let's take a look at how stopping engagements work now. A stopping engagement is triggered during movement when an AV unit moves into an AV ZOC. It is required to stop. Now, if the unit desires to continue movement, it has the option, in some cases, of doing a stopping engagement where it will engage the source that is exerting the AV ZOC into its hex. If it wins that engagement, it may then continue moving with the rest of its remaining movement points. In this case, we have a German AV unit moving down the road, and they have entered the AV ZOC of this American Engineer Battalion. This is a support AV ZOC because it is exerted by the support unit being hosted by these engineers. Being a support AV ZOC means that the German is not required to conduct a stopping engagement. He could, if he does not need to move any further, he can simply move into the hex and stop, ending his movement, and then continue on with the rest of his activation. If, however, the AV ZOC was a real AV ZOC, when the moving unit enters that AV ZOC, it is required to do at least one stopping engagement in an attempt to waive the stop or to, in other words, drive off the unit exerting that ZOC. So, important distinction. Real AV ZOC, a stopping engagement is required. If it is a support AV ZOC, it is not required. The one exception to that is if the support unit, in this case the German 88s, with a range or with a black AV value indicates a standoff AV. If the support unit is a standoff support unit, then the stopping engagement is required even though it's a support AV ZOC. So that's one little change that they've made with the second version 2.0 of the rules. Now, a stopping engagement works just like any other engagement. You will take the firer's AV and action rating, add them together. You will subtract the target's armor value. In this case, it will be the support armor value and the action rating of the host unit. That will give you a modifier. You roll on the engagement table, and the moving unit is considered to have won if the unit exerting the ZOC, the target, is destroyed, if it retreats, or if it's a host unit and the support is dropped. Remember, a stopping engagement is an engagement, which means that it will consume one of the 2 fire events available to the moving unit during this activation. So it's something to keep in mind. If you have already expended one of your fire events and you move into an AV ZOC where the odds may not be all that great of you winning the engagement, you don't want to maybe risk taking a loss, you may just be better off declining to take the stopping engagement and just stop, because even if you win the engagement, because you've already used your first fire event, the stopping engagement will consume your second fire event and you're going to be stopped anyway. Also, light AV, and there are no light AV units in Last Blitzkrieg, but they are in Brazen Chariots. These are your light tankettes, your machine gun armored vehicles. Light AV and all AV armed screening units cannot execute a required stopping engagement. Instead, they become finished. Now, that's an important distinction. They are finished, not stopped. So if you move a light AV unit into an AV ZOC, he's going to be finished, which means he will be unable to attack or any of the other laundry list of items that you cannot do once a unit is finished. So something to keep in mind if you're playing Brazen Chariots, and I'm sure we may see more games show up in the series with light AV down the road. That's pretty much it for stopping engagements. The stopping engagement is merely an attempt by the moving unit to waive the stop by winning an engagement with the unit that is exerting the AV ZOC on them. And that can either be a host unit with support, or it could be a real unit. Now, in this case, if it's a real AV unit, if the moving unit rolls high enough, the defending unit will have to retreat, and by doing so, 1, 2, 3, he'll come back up here. By doing so, now he has waived the stop by basically forcing the enemy unit back, and he could continue moving. If you are facing a support AV ZOC, what is more likely to happen is that instead you will generate a support dropped if you roll well enough. And in this case, the enemy unit, the host unit, does not move. You'll mark it with a support dropped marker, and that then converts the AV ZOC into just a normal ZOC. And because you are a tactical mover, you can then continue moving. Now, let's talk about engagement zones. Again, it uses the word engagement, so you know it's going to involve engagements, but how does an engagement zone differ from an AV ZOC? Well, let's take a look. Engagement zones are generated by AV units out to the extent of their range. And you'll see here, the range for an AV unit is found just below the action rating on the counters. So if it is blank, like we have here on the American unit, they have an action rating of 4, there's nothing below it. That indicates that the range of this unit's AV is 1 hex. On the Tigers here to the right, the Germans have an AV of 5. Below that you see number 2. That indicates that the range for this AV is 2 hexes. Therefore, the engagement zone of the Americans would extend out a single hex, basically into the same hexes as their AV ZOC, whereas the German Tigers would have an engagement zone out to 2 hexes from the unit, which is greater than the adjacent ZOC. This is important distinction here to really understand. ZOCs, whether it's an AV ZOC or a normal ZOC, only ever extend to the hexes adjacent to the unit. An engagement zone is different. An engagement zone is separate from a ZOC, and it will extend out to the range of the unit, terrain and weather permitting. So, if we look at an example here, in this case, on its move side, the engagement zone only extends 1 hex. But if we flip the unit over to its other side here, you can see that now, all of a sudden, it has a range of 2, which means it's going to have an engagement zone out 2 hexes around here, barring terrain and visibility. So even though it has a 2 hex range, the slope terrain in this hex is blocking terrain. Therefore, the engagement zone will not extend into hex 2029 here. It will extend into 1830 because there is no blocking terrain in between the 2 endpoints. And that's really what you're looking for, is any blocking terrain between the 2 endpoints. What are the effects of an engagement zone? They're relatively minor. Essentially, 2 things happen with engagement zones. First, truck type movement units must stop on entering an engagement zone. So if we have the Panzer Grenadiers moving down the road here, once they enter this hex, they are in the 2-hex engagement zone of the American armor, and therefore they must stop. They cannot continue moving here into the zone of control. They will stop immediately upon entering the engagement zone because they are truck movement. Now, if, on the other hand, they were on their deployed side and they had leg type movement, they would go 1, 2, and they could move all the way up to here, because foot and tactical movement are not affected by engagement zones. The second point with engagement zones is that headquarters cannot enter or end a retreat within an engagement zone. Other than that, engagement zones have no effect at all, other than where a unit, an active unit, may be able to initiate an engagement. And here we come into another kind of important aspect of engagement zones that don't really crop up that much in Last Blitzkrieg, but may be more apparent in something like Brazen Chariots with more open terrain. If the German Tiger unit is on its deployed side, it actually has a range of 3 hexes. So its engagement zone, in this case, extends out to 3 hexes from the unit, which means if they were to move and spend 1/2 movement point to enter the secondary road here, he is now 3 hexes from the American unit. Since he is within range, he would be able to initiate an engagement against the American here. Now, it's not a stopping engagement because he's not in the American unit's AV ZOC. This would just be just a normal engagement, if you will. The benefit of doing this is that while he is 3 hexes away from the American unit only has a range of 2 hexes. If the German rolls poorly on the engagement roll, because he is located beyond the range of the target hex, he ignores any loss results. So this is a big advantage for some of these stronger German units, in that as long as the visibility and the terrain allow, they will be able to initiate engagements beyond the range of their target, meaning their target effectively isn't able to return fire on them. And that's always a good thing when you can shoot the bad guys and they can't shoot back. So, engagement zones. Again, they really impact only truck movement and headquarters units. Other than that, what you're really focused on are the AV ZOCs, which extend only in the adjacent hexes. Now, as we said, engagement zones are affected by terrain and they're affected by visibility. In Last Blitzkrieg, you'll have several turns where the visibility is down to a single hex, which means your engagement zone is likewise reduced to a single hex. So if we have 1 hex visibility, in this case, the German unit would not be able to initiate the engagement from this location because they can't see the Americans. They would have to expend another 1.5 movement points, at which point they have now entered the Americans' AV ZOC. So because it's a real AV ZOC exerted by an actual unit on the map, they will be required to do at least 1 stopping engagement. Now, if they were to do a stopping engagement and not drive off the Americans, they could either choose to just stop movement, or they could decide to use their second fire event and do a second engagement in an effort to drive off the Americans. You're not required to continue engaging until you drive the enemy off or until you wave the stop. You are only required to do a single stopping engagement. Anything beyond that is optional. We'll wrap up with an extended example of play, which will allow you to see how all of these concepts, zones of control, stopping engagements, and engagement zones, all work together in what is a sample activation. We're going to assume that the 11th Panzer Division here is the active formation and that it passed its snafu roll with a full result, giving all of its units full movement. The Germans want to redeploy their formation and capture the city here to the west of these American units, but they're going to have to get past them to get into the city. They begin this portion of their activation by starting with their Tiger Battalion here. Now, with unlimited visibility, he has a range of 3, which means the American armor unit here is already in his engagement zone. So he will begin by initiating an engagement which is outside the range of the Americans to try to drive off this American task force. His armor value is 7, his action rating is 5 for a total of 12. The target has an armor value of 3 and an action rating of 4 for a total of 7. 12 minus 7 is a plus 5 on the engagement table, and we'll be looking at the target's real AV line. 7 plus 5 is a 12. That is a target loss and retreat. So the Americans will flip to their move side, and they will have to retreat 3 hexes. The Germans have consumed the first of their 2 fire events. They now proceed to start moving down the road and enter this hex just west of Faucon here. Now, you will note that the engineer battalion here has some AV support, and that AV support actually has a range of 3, which means its engagement zone goes out to 3 hexes. However, it is a support unit, and it is not, that has no impact on the actual AV ZOC. The Tigers, even though they are theoretically in an engagement zone of this unit, are not affected at all by it. And again, for a couple of reasons. One, it's a support. Number 2, they're not a truck or headquarters unit. So engagement zones are not going to, they don't have to worry about these engineers unless they end up moving adjacent to them, at which point they will have entered the support AVZOC. Now, he's reached his limit of his movement allowance, but he does have a range of 3, and he can see the Americans here 2 hexes away. So he will use his second fire event to engage the Americans and hopefully drive them completely off of this secondary road leading into the city. He'll do this, and you'll notice also that because the Americans have flipped to their move side, their range has been reduced from 2 down to 1. So he is still outside of the range of this American unit, and thus he can engage them at no risk to himself. This engagement is going to be even better than the last one because he still has AV7, action rating 5 for a total of 12, but the Americans now only have an AV of 2 with an AR of 4 for a total of 6. That makes it a plus 6. And even though he rolls a 5, the 6 makes it an 11, which is a target loss and retreat. So once again, the American unit is going to have to retreat 3 hexes and take a second step loss. Now, because the Tigers have used their second fire event, they are now stopped, and that's as far as they're going to be able to go this activation. We still have an AV ZOC located here on the road, exerted by the support unit hosted by these engineers. So the Germans decide that they are going to move up their other Panzer battalion, 1, 2, 3. They have now entered the support AV ZOC from the engineers. They have a choice. Because it's a support AV ZOC, they can simply accept the stop and end their movement right there without performing any engagement on the engineers. And that's because it is, again, a support ZOC. If they had moved adjacent to a real unit, the real AV ZOC would have required at least 1 stopping engagement. So the Panzers, however, are going to go ahead and take this opportunity to attempt to engage the engineers. They will spend their first fire event to do a stopping engagement, which will give them an AV of 4, action rating of 4 is an 8. The defenders have an AV of 3 and an action rating of 3 for a total of 6. So they have a plus 2, but this time we're looking at the targeted support line on the engagement table. And a 5, again, it's not a very good result. Plus 2 becomes a 7. That is enough for a target drop result, which means that the support of the engineers has been dropped, and they will be marked with a dropped support. Now, having marked the target unit as support dropped, this AV-ZOC now no longer exists because the support has been driven off. However, a normal ZOC still exists here. But again, that doesn't affect the tactical movement type. If the Panzer Battalion had remaining movement points, it could continue then moving, but because it was on its deployed side, it has expended all of its movement allowance. It will be unable to move further because it's out of movement points. So with that in mind, it still has one fire event left, and it decides I will go ahead and make an attack by fire on the non-AV unit here. They are in terrain, so it will be a 5 or 6 to inflict a step loss. A 6 does in fact inflict a step loss on the American engineers. And we can now mark the battalion as stopped as a reminder that they will be moving no further. Now, since the AV-ZOC has been dropped by the engagement, the initial engagement of the Panzer Battalion, that means that any other tactical movers can move right by 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5, 5, 6, 7, and occupy the city. We'll take our other tank battalion and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we'll actually move up here. Now, we've entered the AV-ZOC of Task Force Duval. That, because it's a real AV-ZOC, this requires the German Panzer Battalion to do at least one stopping engagement. And we will do so now. We have an AV-4, action rating 4 for 8, and the Americans have an AV-2, action rating 4 for 6. It is a +2 on the target is real AV line. A poor roll is a 4 + 2 is a 6. That's going to be a both loss. The Germans decide to try one more time with the +2. And this time the second fire event goes much better, and that 10 becomes a 12, which is target loss and retreat. 1, 2, 3. So the Americans now have suffered 1, 2, 3, 4 step losses, bringing them to the verge of destruction, and they've been pushed well out of the immediate vicinity of the city. That second fire event will bring the panzers to a stop. Now, the headquarters begins moving 1, 2, 3.5. Normally, a ZOC is negated only for safe path. It can also be negated for the purposes of headquarters movement, which means the headquarters does not have to stop upon reaching this hex. It can instead continue moving 1, 2, 3.5, 4, 5.5, and occupy the city. Lastly, we'll have the Panzer Grenadier Battalion come up. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, it's truck movement. It has entered a normal ZOC. It must stop movement. We cannot negate for this unit. However, subsequently, we will go ahead and attack the Americans here with the Panzer Grenadier Battalion, and we'll have the Panzer Battalion underneath assist them. We would then launch a normal attack, and assuming they rolled high enough, they would drive off the Americans, and they would enter the hex. Now, you can see there's some slope terrain there, which means they probably can't do that because slope is prohibited to trucks. So they would be essentially stuck here. But you can see as far as the engagement zones, zones of control, etc., how that worked, where the Germans were able to push back or eliminate the ZOCs, allowing their units to move forward, and also how the headquarters was allowed to move up the road through the ZOC because a friendly unit was already present in that hex. I hope this makes the whole concept of zones of control, AV ZOCs, engagement zones, stopping engagements a little bit clearer for you the next time you get BCS on the table. I know I've probably babbled on a lot longer than I was intending to, so I appreciate you sticking with me through this. Thanks for watching today, and we'll see you next time.